So this video will help you understand not just how to read Nietzsche, but how to read any philosopher with a distinctive literary style of their own.
We've got to start with a very basic concept, which is that ideas wear rhetorical clothes. Sometimes you can separate the idea from the rhetorical clothes it's wearing, and when the clothes come off, the idea basically remains the same. But sometimes the external clothes and the idea are inseparable, and we need to look at why that's like that. Take this example. Human beings want stuff. Imagine finding that as a sentence in a philosophical text. And then imagine its alternative, which is something like this. There is a significant degree of universality in what is necessarily part of any human being's motivational set. You see the difference? Take another example that's now not made up. Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, famously discusses Plato's form of the good. And against Plato, he says, look, a white thing isn't going to be any more white if it's white for an eternity than if it were white for a single day. Imagine the analytically transparent version of that. Just because a maximalist version of an idea is flawed does not mean that a more modest incarnation of the same idea is going to be flawed too. Let's jump more and take another example. A line from Nietzsche. Pick anything you want. We need art lest we perish from the truth. Now imagine an analytically transparent version of that. Experience of great art allows us to engage with some of the deepest truths about human life without being destabilized by them, as we would be if we had encountered them in life. Now, what do you lose when you put things in this dry, transparent way that almost a machine could generate, that you don't lose if you put it in a stylized way, and the style is legit, you're not just bullshitting or fluffing your writing up pointlessly? Well, here are the key questions that the stylized way of writing allows you to put front and center. First of all, who is this writing for? Why is this thing that's on the page on the page? Is this piece of writing addressing an error? And if so, and it does address an error in each of our examples, where does the error come from? We're not just trying to correct the error, we're trying to explore what the source of the error is. And the opposite of this is a way of writing that just tries to distinguish what is a true thing to say from what is a false thing to say without any depth beyond that. I once had a conversation with a professor of philosophy, this was quite a few years ago when I was doing my PhD, who is an expert, international expert in her field. And I said, look, tell me what it's like for you to do philosophy. And she said, well, you know what it's like? It's thinking of all of the things that can be said about the world in two piles. In that pile go statements that are true, and in this pile go statements that are false. Now, this is an approach to philosophy that Nietzsche would want to just smash to smithereens or mock. Now, the questions we have asked were crucial for Nietzsche, but there was something else that was really important to him that made him not write in this kind of pile A and pile B way. And that's that he wanted to protect his writing from incorporation into the academy. He wanted his writing to be very difficult to digest for anybody who wanted to reconstruct it in the form of a textbook. But I think we should dive deeper here. When philosophers engage with one another deeply, when they carry each other's baton, if you like, after one dies, for example, and the next one picks their thing up, what often gets passed over aren't ideas, but concerns. Here's Avishai Margalit on this.
The highest tribute to an intellectual is not the one who makes his beliefs our beliefs. It is the one who makes his concerns an agenda, our concerns an agenda.
What happens if you forget about concerns and just start thinking in terms of what propositionally Nietzsche said? Well, you can run into a real problem. And here is an important Nietzsche scholar, Brian Leiter, in my opinion, face-planting just on this issue. So this is a conference celebrating the work of Bernard Williams, who was a very Nietzschean thinker and a very Nietzschean writer, particularly as his life went on.
Bernard Williams' debt to Nietzsche is superficial, although not illusory. Yet it marks such a dramatic departure from the creditor's main ideas and claims as to make the suggested affinity more misleading than illuminating.
And here, the admirable philosopher Miranda Fricker asks Brian Leiter a question about the extent to which Nietzsche might not, after all, recognize Williams as a kind of follower of him.
I wondered whether you had any sympathy with the idea that what Williams takes from Nietzsche above all is the critical program within morality. I quite take the point that he's not sort of, as it were, going in for any totalizing smashing or anything, but rather he is at his most Nietzschean when he's calling out bluff, when he's seeing through the positing of objectivity that isn't really there, seeing through the positing of external reasons which are really internal. Is that not Nietzschean?
And Brian Leiter says no. And the reason Leiter says no is that he sees significant discrepancies between the philosophical positions that Nietzsche takes and the philosophical positions that Bernard Williams takes.
That arguably reflects, again, that he read Nietzsche, and this was partly why he was more sympathetic to Nietzsche, say, than someone like Derek Parfit. And it's precisely because he didn't object to, being highly skeptical about morality's pretensions in various ways. So that's fair enough. I agree with that. Again, I think you're going to find on a lot of the details and, as it were, the extremity of it, that there are some that there are striking differences. And you see that again with, Williams's whole emphasis on, maintaining an idea of the voluntary and responsibility and so on, which Nietzsche doesn't. This is Williams again. People's deliberations, their thoughts about what to do, issued in their actions. These truths are obvious. Nietzsche denies them all.
But this comes with complete disregard for the concerns that Williams shared with Nietzsche. Here are some of them. What's happening here is that Brian Leiter is misrepresenting Bernard Williams, he's misrepresenting Nietzsche, and he's misrepresenting philosophy. So philosophy won, Leiter nil, Williams won, Leiter nil, Nietzsche won, Leiter nil.
3. Respect.
This is what happens when you ride roughshod over serious engagement around the continuity of concerns between one philosopher and another. Nevertheless, I do want to emphasize that I respect Brian Leiter's work, and I still actually recommend his books on Nietzsche for anybody who wants to find out more. And let's go a bit further. If you watch philosophy on YouTube, you're going to see many videos here with Bryan Magee. Brian died a year or two ago, and a couple of his videos are interviews with Bernard Williams. And Brian was a friend of Bernard's for decades and decades and decades. And one of the things Brian could observe is how Bernard became more and more Nietzschean until he, as Brian would put it to me, began to identify with Nietzsche, which Brian felt Bernard was already doing in the 1980s. So what does Brian mean when he says that Bernard's identifying with Nietzsche? He does not mean that there are 17 things Nietzsche thinks and that Bernard thinks 14 of them. No. Nor, interestingly, does he think that Bernard is identifying with Nietzsche, the biographical person. No. What Brian is saying is that he is observing Bernard identify with the concerns of Nietzsche as a philosopher, and the way these concerns should sit in one for us to properly understand them for what they are. Nietzsche was deeply concerned with how you think and with how an idea sits in you, not just with what you think. Very often when we do philosophy, we are it's not very often. Virtually always, when professional philosophers do philosophy, and I say this unfortunately, it's true of 99.9% of my colleagues, they are simply oblivious to process. They're trying to get from A to B, but they're not asking, should I be on a skateboard? Should I jump from a car to a tram? Can I fly some of the distance? And so there's just a desire to head in the right direction, but no conversation about how one travels. And for Nietzsche, this business of habituating oneself into understanding how to travel is absolutely central. Philosophical process is just as important for Nietzsche, if not more important, than what you think. How is your process with not falling for the superficially reassuring? How is your process with encountering a new idea and just looking at it without trying to do anything about it and waiting for something to happen in virtue of the quality of access you have to your unconscious mind? So all of these things, and we can make a large list of them, are absolutely central matters of process. And process is as important for Nietzsche and some of the great philosophers that have lived in history as the matter of simply propositionally laying things out and seeing who is right and who is wrong. And there is another startling consequence that we must acknowledge, and it's this, that you can write great philosophy while getting nearly everything wrong. Now you might say, well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because, as the beautiful Charles Taylor likes to point out, the causal arrow between social practice, what's actually going on in the world, and philosophical ideas points in both directions. Philosophers take ideas from the culture, do something with them, and then spit them back out into the culture. So the ideas are coming in to the mind of a philosopher who applies philosophical process to them. And then the philosopher spits them back out into the culture. And one way of doing something great is to take the distortions and illusions out there in the culture and present them in a very systematic and brilliant way and spit them back out into the culture. Now, even if you participate in the same cultural illusions as you write about them, what you write can still be great philosophy. I was terribly told off by my PhD supervisor about 15 years ago.
What does this man think that I'm advocating?
I wrote in my PhD that Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals was a tour de force of profound stupidity. And by that, I didn't mean that it was superficial. I thought it was one of the greatest works of moral philosophy ever written. But I thought it mirrored back to us certain illusions we have about how, in principle if not in practice, the world could be ultimately just, an illusion that persists and an illusion that is worth philosophically investigating. Let's now turn to some practical tips. Tip number 1, stop using 3 terms.
3.
1 is straw manning, 2 is steel manning, and 3 is sense making. Now, the cultural disease that are these terms, and they're very prominent in the intellectual dark web, the cultural disease that they are is this business of trying to line up one's propositions and get them right. So if all you're going around is steel manning your opponent's positions, or steel manning some positions you're just trying to understand, that's not good. And people are going around all over the internet congratulating themselves on this. Clubhouse is full of rooms where people steel man this and steel man that. But in fact, you've got to get out of this business of piling things into 2 piles, the pile that's true and the pile that's false. Nietzsche talked about dipping into deep ideas like you dip into a cold shower, in and out. One of the things that I strongly recommend is that you dip in and out of Nietzsche as you come to explore him more. And what you do is you take little dips into probably his 3 best books, The Gay Science, The Genealogy of Morals, and Beyond Good and Evil. And the way you dip is that you pick the most aphoristic bits, and here The Gay Science might be really the best place to start. And you just read them. And you read them again. And my strong advice is that you play around 5 times over with Nietzsche's best works before you jump to reading his entire corpus. Now, once you have done that and you move on to more complex Nietzschean waters, one of the things you're going to have to keep in mind is at what point Nietzsche begins to go loopy. Because in some of his writing, he's going loopy gradually. And that being so, it's still right to take what he's saying very seriously. And it's still true that we can find philosophical materials of genius in some of what he writes, even in his strange autobiography, Ecce Homo. But what's really important is that we develop the skills to understanding the way in which Nietzsche's physical illness affected the way his intellectual process worked. And that question is going to be in its entirety the subject matter of the next video in the Nietzsche series. It's going to be here, but until it's here, the other video about the eternal recurrence is going to be just on this side.